no water. Everybody forgot it, and water evaporates pretty fast this kind of weather. Margaret asked me to take it, cage and all, for fear Emily finds it. If anyone wants it later and I'm not around, it will be behind the old barrel in the corner of our stable. No need to leave it where the poor old girl might see it and have a fit. He went along then cheerfully enough, but leaving me filled with dismay and remorse. Long after he had disappeared, I remained in the garage, grieving over a little yellow bird which had had to die of hunger and thirst. Indeed, I was still there when Holmes came out, after his breakfast. He did not see me at first. He came into the garage whistling and moved directly to a corner, where with his foot he stirred up and scattered a small heap of fine black ashes on the cement floor. It was only when that was done that he managed to grin. "Burned some letters last night," he said. "Never keep anything around that will get you into trouble. That's my motto, miss. And your mother is down for breakfast." I went out, my mind confused in many ways but entirely clear on one point. Mr. Dean would never find the pages Holmes had cut out of his book. I was depressed when I left the garage. It seemed to me that we would never solve our problem, that clues came and went and still led nowhere. And yet it was that very morning that I found the second glove, found it indeed in a spot which had been examined over and over the afternoon and evening after the crime. This was under the dining room window at the back of the Lancaster house, and almost directly beneath Margaret Lancaster's bedroom. Chapter 20. Outwardly that Sunday morning on the Crescent differed little from any of the innumerable ones which I can remember. Our servants divided as usual, one out and one in, where there were three one took the day off, one went presumably to 11 o'clock service and one remained at home to prepare the heavy midday dinner which after the week's light luncheons sent most of us into a coma during the afternoon. And the Crescent allows no decent interval for grief. One submits to what mother calls the eternal will, puts on one's heaviest black, and shows to the world an unbroken front of submission to God. At 11:15 then the road was lined with cars, the Daltons' sedan, our own limousine, the Lancasters' hired car and George Talbot's aged roadster with Lydia in the rumble seat, where she got all the dust and wind. But Emily Lancaster did not appear. She had been brought home and put to bed, and our Mary reported that she had looked like a ghost. I was an interested onlooker at all this, have begged off with a cold which was real enough at that. I stood on the porch and waved mother off, and I remember watching the other cars go by, each laden with black draped figures, and wondering if there was not someone in that funereal group who would kneel that morning under the stained glass windows of St. Mark's and beg an unseen God for forgiveness and mercy. It was a bright morning. The cold spell had gone, but there was a hint of autumn in the garden. Back in no man's land a small child, as if aware that the overlords had departed, was trundling a red wagon, and across the intervening strip I could see that Mrs. Lancaster's windows had been raised, as though by airing the room they could somehow remove the last trace of the little old woman who had died in it. Except for those open windows and what they suggested, the crescent had resumed its normal appearance. The curious crowd had gone from the gate, hereafter it would follow our story in the newspapers and not on its feet. Reporters no longer lay in wait to trap us as we entered or left our houses. Even the guards were gone, and either the police were taking a Sunday holiday or the search in no man's land had been abandoned. But if the front of the crescent was quiet, the rear was not. The moment the cars had all departed it bloomed into life and activity. The maids sang or laughed, and after a time there was a gradual emergence from the houses, and a conversation apparently on the kitchen porch of the Dalton house, where I gathered that tea, and probably cake, was being served. Ellen from the Lancasters was the first to go, followed by our Mary, Annie being out that day. And before long the austere black-robed figure of Lizzie from the Talbots came into view along the path, and she too joined the party. The thing interested me. It was the first time I had seen our grapevine telegraph in full operation, and I watched it from the rear window of the upper hall. What did they talk about together, these servants of ours, so many of whom had lived with us for many years? What did they think? What did they know? For I was certain that they knew something, perhaps many things. What, for instance, did Mrs. Talbot's Lizzie know about that strange locking up? Or the Daltons' Joseph of that search a few nights before? Or about the quarrel which long ago had separated master and mistress? All this was running through my mind when I saw Mr. Dean emerge from across no man's land, casually following the path and looking in his dark clothes very much indeed like a gentleman's gentleman returning from a Sunday ramble. I saw him glance toward the Dalton porch and then look away, and I saw him finally reach our garage, well shielded from that porch, try the door to the staircase which leads to Holmes's living quarters, find it locked, and then, sheltered from any but my observation by the shrubbery, take a key book from his pocket and carefully experiment with the lock. It was less than a minute until the door opened and he disappeared inside. St. Mark's is well downtown, and I was confident that he had an hour at the least before Holmes would return. Nevertheless, I was relieved when in some 10 minutes Mr. Dean reappeared, cautiously closed the door, which has a snap lock, and then entered the garage below. But all this was more than any anxiety could bear, so I snatched up my garden scissors and a basket and was in time to come almost face to face with him as he emerged. He touched his cap and greeted me cheerfully. "What, not at church?" "I had a headache. Or a cold. I forget which,"